Thank you everyone for joining today for Sediment Stories 10. And we'll be speaking with Tarun today. And welcome to this 10th session. My name is Aishani and I work with Veditum as a senior associate. I'm also joined by my team members Siddharth, Madhapa, Shamika, and Ria today. And I'll introduce, like Siddharth said, a little bit about the organization and the work we do here. Veditum is an is trying to transform the environmental governance landscape of India. And we're trying to do this by creating environmental leaders who are empathetic, creating evidence at scale, and empowering people and communities to take action. And our work is at the intersection of social and environmental justice. As an organization and through our Moving Upstream project, with our fellows and the team, we have walked along 6 rivers in India that's more than 6,000 kilometers. And we've documented very deeply the condition of the rivers, how people live along the rivers, the riverine ecosystem that is there for the Ganga, Ken, Betwa, Sindh, and the Luni. And during these walks, we have also noticed a very major threat to the rivers, which is sand mining. And you know that we use sand for building houses, for infrastructure development. We also use it to make the chips that go into our laptops, electronics. So sand is a very important and very pervasive in our lives. But to actually see where is all this sand coming from, and just a fact that sand is the most extracted mineral on the planet. And we're extracting this mineral from rivers, and it is impacting rivers and the people who live close to it a lot. And that's how the India Sandwatch project also built and took shape. This project is an environmental accountability project. Uh, and at the heart of the project is an open data platform that we have built in partnership with Uloy Labs. And uh, the platform allows people to archive data on sand mining. We can also share the link of the platform. And along with this platform, we also focus on mainstreaming conversations around sand sediment. And we also work on looking at the river governance and what governs uh, and what are the regulations on sand mining. Um, with with this, I would also like to talk about sediment stories, which is a part of how we imagine and reimagine conversations to take place around sediments. We want to host these conversations with people who work around sand and sediments. And today we have Tarun Nair. We also collaborate quite deeply with Wildlife Conservation Trust, and Tarun has been a very helpful and supportive role in this. Um, Tarun will be sharing about a Gharial's perspective on how flow regimes shape river ecosystems and species ecologies. Tarun is a conservation biologist with an affinity for crocodilians and rivers. He leads the Makara program at the Wildlife Conservation Trust, and his work has largely focused on understanding the conservation needs of gharials in north central part of India, particularly the Chambal, Son, and Gandak Rivers. He's also interested in human wildlife interactions, conservation philosophy, policy, and the human impacts of on wildlife and ecosystems. Thank you for joining us today, Tarun. Yeah, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks, Aishani. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you. And maybe, Darren, we can start by you telling us about your work and the species and the landscape that you work in and how you got interested about working in it.
Yeah, so I've been interested in reptiles because I started my conservation career pretty much rescuing snakes and so on when I was in high school. And I got a chance because I completed college through Open University. I had a chance to work with a number of organizations during that period. And one such chance was to work on a human crocodile conflict project across the country. And that's when I first visited the Chambal in maybe 2005 or six. And yeah, so having seen the place, then I certainly wanted to come back here and had a chance to come back here during my master's thesis. I had two options, and because I'd been introduced to crocodilians then, I had two options. One was to um, locate the gut content of saltwater crocodiles in the Andamans, because that was one of the sites that I'd been to. But unfortunately, that project got shot down. My supervisors didn't think it was viable. And but more seriously, in 2007 and 8, there was a large die-off. About over 100 adult, subadult Gharials perished in the Chambal. It was a mysterious die-off because various theories and ideas were proposed as to why they perished, and no one has answers yet. So it was suggested that me coming to the Chambal and looking at studying Gharials would be a useful contribution then to try and understand what happened, to keep an eye on if if further incidences were occurring and so on. So I came back here, and that fascination, that initial fascination, is, I think, just grown and continues to grow. So yeah, I've been in this landscape more or less since then, except for a few years around COVID. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is quite an interesting work journey and being introduced to reptiles from a very young age. I think I understand how it just kept increasing over time. And maybe you can also tell us how working with gharials also led to an interest on sediments and how the species and the landscape for where you work in, what is the importance of sediments in that landscape?
Yeah. So initially, I didn't give sediment much thought. It was it was just something inert and in the background, and often thought of it as an impediment because it would get in the way of some delicate equipment and so on. But having been through the first Gharial breeding cycle is when I got to appreciate sand itself and how closely linked it is with the species biology and many such species in this landscape. There's one other crocodile, the mugger crocodile. You've got 8 to 9 species of freshwater turtles, a whole suite of ground nesting birds like the Indian skimmer, black-bellied terns, and so on. So all of these, yeah, helped me appreciate sand for what it was. And it was more so after I started kayaking and canoeing that I started appreciating sediment transport processes, because one had to be more uh, attentive to how of where you would find depth in a river, what channels, especially in a braided river, what channels are navigable, and so on. One had to learn to read the river based on the banks, then looking at flow conditions. So then you learn to appreciate how what allows channels to remain deep. You try and get some sense of both aggradation and degradation processes. And all of this, I think, helped appreciate rivers as conduits for both water and sand better. Yeah, so that really changed my perspective on viewing rivers as these sorts of great transporters of both water, energy, material from upstream, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I think this is a very learned experience, canoeing and kayaking, and to learn about the river channels. Maybe you would, if you could tell us more about the flow regimes that you had mentioned, and um, how does that also intersect with the habitats of all the species that you mentioned?
Sure. So I'll just share some slides. I think a visual representation of that would
Yes.
help people who may not be familiar with it. Uh, Let me just. Yeah, is my screen visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay. So yeah, to start off with, I'll just briefly introduce what we do at the Wildlife Conservation Trust. We've got a couple of programs that focus on rivers, and some of our shared concerns are on the impacts of dams, on how they impact river flow, sediment transport. We're looking at the impacts of sand mining on these habitats and what they do mean to species. Looking at fisheries and the issue of bycatch, and also other threats in terms of poaching, illegal trade, especially with species like freshwater turtles. And we've been engaging both students and building conservation capacity for frontline forest staff. So one of the focuses of this discussion is going to be ecological flows. And simply put, and what you're seeing here is a false color composite of the Lena River in Siberia. And I've just used this to illustrate the different colors which represent different habitat types formed by both flow and sediment processes that create this sort of delta. And one would ask, what are ecological flows? And to put it very simply, it's just water for nature. Um, Earlier, we used to have this concept of environmental flows, which mostly prescribed minimum flow conditions, allowing some water for nature after having satisfied most human interests and needs. But ecological flows are slightly more different because it takes into account what species need inherently rather than what can be spared for them. So that's the primary difference. And then one might ask, why look at ecological flows at all? And the answer to that lies in the fact that most of the world's rivers are impacted by a fair degree of human activity and suffer from considerable, say, fragmentation, regulation, sediment trapping, and consumptive water use. And so these four maps highlight these sorts of the degree of regulation and fragmentation. And if one looks at India, we're doing rather poorly in all four counts. So then coming back to flow regime. So the natural flow regime of a river, it's important in many aspects because there are many interrelated mechanisms which operate over multiple spatial and temporal scales. And this relationship between biodiversity and the physical nature of aquatic habitat is likely to be driven primarily by the large events, especially in the form of floods, the rising and the falling limbs. And many features of flow regimes in turn influence life history parameters for several species, especially in the seasonality and predictability of these patterns, but also in the timing of these sorts of flow events. And many of these flowing events also help trigger both longitudinal and lateral dispersal of many organisms and helps complete different parts of their life cycles. And typically, native biota in any habitat, they evolved in response to these sorts of flow regimes. And this is what, and having natural flow regimes is one of the one important factor in keeping invasive species out of their native ranges. And yeah, so what you're seeing here is a series of satellite images between 1988 and the early 2000s. And this is an area, this is part of the Padma River, just below the confluence of the Ganga and Brahmaputra. And you can see the kind of transformations that take place. Typically, you just assume water flowing upstream to downstream, but you can see how it changes the banks, how it changes in width at different times of the year, across years. So it's just to help people appreciate how dynamic these sorts of systems are. And it also helps illustrate both aggregation and degradation processes that you see and how sediment is moved and settled at different times of the year in different locations. So, yeah, so like I mentioned before, rivers transport sediment by eroding upland areas and then carry them lowland and eventually into the world's oceans, which is what helps prevent coastal erosion in many parts of the world. And they're also able to transport this material because of the potential energy they possess. And over their course, this energy is dissipated primarily through sediment transport and through frictional resistance of the riverbed, of the rocks, of the surrounding vegetation, and other features that one encounters in a river. And it's this transport of river and how it's distributed downstream, which plays a very important role in the development and quality of different riverine ecosystems. And you see some of these ecosystems, our habitat types here, often known as riffles, runs, pools, and so on. And and these dynamics are what help determine a river's morphology and habitat forming processes. And in response, a lot of species, their biologies are a result and a response to these sort of habitats that are available downstream. What often happens is if the continuity of flow of the sort of sediment transport is interrupted for any reason, then you often have situations where the river becomes sediment starved and is prone to erode downstream channel beds and banks. And this is a process that's often known as hungry waters, because the rivers, when they don't have enough sediment being carried downstream, their erosional power increases. So what we're looking at is in some sense the river wave concept, which is a simple it's a simple framework to try and unify several river ecosystem concepts. So it was conceptualized as a series of waves varying in both in shape, in amplitude, in wavelength, and frequency. And in other words, these waves are analogous to river hydrographs. And so it describes the interaction of waves with the environment and how they're influenced by climate, by geology, and by human activity. And in turn, how these influence riverscapes and biota. So coming back to the Gharial. For those unfamiliar with it, this is a long-snouted fish-eating crocodile. It's native to the Indian subcontinent, with a range, at least formerly, from the Indus in the west to the Irrawaddy in the east. But today it's confined largely to the Gangetic Basin, with close to 80% of the world's population in one river, the Chambal, which also has the National Chambal Sanctuary. And it's a case of almost all your eggs in one basket, which is unfortunate, but also highlights how important this river is to the Gharial, has been to its its persistence till today, and will play an important role going forward. So, from the vantage point of a gharial, the river is not just a conduit for water, but also a seasonally pulsed ecosystem whose flow regime structures every aspect of life. And so, in some sense, flow determines where sandbanks emerge, how fish move, which is their primary prey, when breeding is possible, and whether it remains a living system or degrades into fragmented habitats. And when fragmented, you need to understand that these populations become isolated, they're unable to interact with one another. So you're left with a series of pools which are disconnected for most of the year. And that also amplifies the kind of threats and challenges the species face. And so the Gharial's ecology is therefore, what do you say, useful way to, or useful lens to understand how hydrological processes shape riverine biodiversity more broadly. And if you remember the hydrograph from earlier, so the natural flow regime is not just the quantum of water flowing upstream to downstream, but also defined by the magnitude, the timing, the duration of these flows, the frequency, and the rate of change of these processes. How fast are these flood pulses coming? What time of the year, and so on. And for Gharials, the strong seasonal context, contrast between these sorts of low dry season flows and high monsoonal flows, they're both important because low flows expose sandbanks, which are required for breeding. And these sandbanks also important for thermoregulation, um, and nesting and social interactions. And this is one of the most aquatic of crocodilians. They don't spend a lot of time traversing over land because the hind limbs are rather weak. So they only manage to crawl onto sandbars. And that's also where a lot of visual interactions take place because these waters are mostly murky and they're unable to communicate underwater, uh, at least in terms of displays and so on. And apart from that, the gradual recession of these monsoonal flood deposits also help them choose nesting sites that are safe from sudden, say, rainfall-related increases in flow and so on. And high flows also maintain deep pools for the rest of the year because of channel scouring events and increasing channel complexity. And these pools function as dry season refugia for both for themselves and for large-bodied prey in these habitats. And they provide hydraulic shelter where gharials conserve energy because these are species that are known as thermoconformers. They're unable to regulate their own body temperature like mammals, so they're dependent on environmental temperatures. And deep waters are what allows them to do so effectively. So the deeper water column is, uh, the less prone it is to fluctuate, both to extreme heat or extreme cold.
But
And and these sorts of periodic floods also scar excessive vegetation. They help redistribute sediments and maintain channel connectivity, both upstream, downstream, and with their lateral environment.
Tarun, sorry to interrupt at this point.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think this is great to know that how seasonality affects the habitats of the species and how all of that is their life cycle is also in sync with the species. Maybe you can, maybe you're doing that now, but you can like talk a little bit more about how the sediments in the sandbanks become such important breeding and nesting sites. And I think you mentioned about them being also doing the social interactions, all of that. And maybe also shed some light on how the people who live there close to the river and how what is their relationship with the rivers and gharials. And maybe if you would also like to talk about the work that you do with the community members there.
Yeah. So, if I start off from the Chambal, so rivers like the Chambal and Son, they're peninsular tributaries of the Ganga. They emerge from the Vindhyan foreland. So these are rivers that are considered stable in terms of at least their course, because they emerge from the Indian craton, which is the craton is the oldest part of the Earth's crust. And so they are different from the Himalayan rivers because the Himalayas are at least geologically a more recent. The young mountains, they're more erosive, and because of the erosive nature and the velocities that these rivers carry, those systems are more prone to changing course, a process known as channel avulsion. So, in terms of how people interact, their interactions are often governed by how stable these systems are, how sediment processes, or how sediments they distribute themselves downstream. Uh, at least in the Chamberlain zone, because you have stable banks, people are not generally affected by these processes, except for high water in the floods. And here the relationship with sand has largely been exploitative because of illegal sand mining, often driven by a cartel. And these are things that I'll describe in more detail later on in the talk. But if you look at the Himalayan tributaries like the Ghagra and Gandak, which are Gharial habitats, you often see large scale movement or relocation because of these sorts of flooding events, because these are not stable lands. Both village settlements and farmland are often inundated. Sometimes they become part of the channel when rivers change course. So you often see both instances of people having to respond quicker to these sorts of events, having to relocate and to try and make the best of those situations, because they'll have to start cultivating on whatever land emerges. So you see a lot of riverbed agriculture for cucurbits and so on. But what we also observe is that because the sediment from these rivers, from the Gagra and Gandak, most of the Himalayan tributaries, they're not sought after for construction because of the fineness of the sediment, and because of that, sand mining is not an issue, or not a conservation issue, at least for the species in those systems, which is different from what we see in the Son and the Gandak, where the core sediment is highly sought after in the construction industry, and then drives a lot of activity because of that. And we've been trying to address some of that, mainly to understand what drives this sort of exploitation. So we've been working with schools, with students, with the theory of change being that better awareness will bring about behavioral change and so on, at least for people, for the generation that's still in school and not involved directly in sand mining. But yeah, these are results that we'll see only maybe 5 or 10 years down the line. And so what we're seeing now are just attempts to try and address that. Although we are unable to tackle illegal mining head on, we're helping forest departments and other agencies by monitoring and recording instances of mining, and helping governments chart a policy, effective policy to try and curb these sorts of impacts.
Yeah. I think thanks for sharing how it's different across different landscapes and riverscapes, the relationship how what people have with their rivers. And maybe before I ask the next question to you, I can request people who are listening, if you have any questions, just write them in the chat and we'll take it at the end of the conversation. And Tarun, like you mentioned a little bit about sand mining and how it has been impacting and fragmenting rivers. And if you'd like to talk a little bit more about that now.
Yeah, so I can show you some images of
Yeah.
what sand mining has done. I'll share my screen again. Mm, Is my screen already shared?
No, I think you'll have to share it again.
Okay. Okay, I'll just share my entire screen. That's going to be easier. Yeah, what about now?
Yes, we can see the first slide, the current slide.
Okay. Yeah, so before I just jump into mining, I'll just look at how some of these other processes and how gharial habitats are likely to change because of these sorts of or because of mining, and why it's so closely linked to sediment and the availability of sediment. So yeah, so like I mentioned, successful reproduction requires not only sandbanks but also a certain level of what we can call as flow stability during the nesting season. Sudden releases from upstream dams, which we often face, can and often does inundate nests, while unseasonally low flows during the incubation period often exposes nests and eggs to a lot of predators. And this is increasingly so because these are human dominated landscapes, and there was a large population of feral or free ranging dogs in these areas, and they're increasingly becoming predators for species like gharials and turtles. So while floods are necessary at the right time and scale, unnatural flow volatility is also detrimental. And as a species, the gharial exemplifies why uh, a species adapted to do this sort of predictability. But this is predictability within variability, because flow doesn't stay constant through the year. So that's these seasonal pulses are rather important. The important pulses are important rather than erratic shocks in the system. And for what do you say? If you look at overall management, for effective management of these sorts of systems, one needs to move beyond minimum flows and look at more ecologically functional flows based on species life histories and so on. And in this sense, the gharial is a good indicator species, because rivers that support viable gharial populations also tend to support other species that with similar ecological needs and adaptations. And and by safeguarding these sorts of systems and processes, we'll also be able to safeguard broader riverine biodiversity and ecosystem functions, which makes them excellent flagship species for these sorts of systems. But unfortunately, most, at least the Chambal, which is the biggest and most contiguous gharial habitat, faces a large level of illegal sand mining because of the kind of sand that it brings down from the Indian foreland. And these sorts of scenes are not uncommon. What used to be and mining is not new; it's always been there. But till about 2010 or so, was mostly you would mostly observe. No, not in 2010, maybe till 2015 or so. You typically observed tractors with a handful of men manually filling in trolleys, and it was a laborious, time-consuming process. And because of that, you would have a few tractors at each of these sites. and you didn't have complete loss of nesting. But now with the increased usage and availability of earth movers and backhoes, the scale of mining has changed completely. And this, so what used to take, say, a good hour to fill a trolley now takes less than 30 seconds. So you can imagine the number of tractors and trucks that are moving sand out from these systems. And yeah, so this is an example of, this is a site called Rithora in the Chambal. Used to be one of the best nesting sites. At one point had 60 to 70 nesting females. And you can see the scale of mining at this. The entire site is being ravaged. And you can see some of these animals still basking in these areas because they have to use this site because it's next to a deep pool, and it gives them year-round refuge habitat. But they can't leave this place and go elsewhere because you don't have these sorts of deep pool areas very frequently. And what happens in terms of nesting is that they'll continue or they'll attempt nesting in suboptimal habitat, often choosing substrate that's less conducive to nesting than sand, often in mud. And this is a species that does well when they nest colonially, in the sense that several females nest on the same bar, which means that you have several attendant females. So there's better protection for these nests from predators. But now these groups have to break up into smaller groups of maybe 3, 4, 5 animals nest in different areas, and they're unable to protect these nests because there aren't enough females to guard these nests. So that's what we're seeing increasingly. And we'll just see what happens between 2015 and so on. So we've just put together satellite imagery to look at how this nest site has changed in area, and we'll see what's happened specifically from 2015 onwards. So this is the large sandbar that you see. And nesting typically happens along the margin of this bar. And since 15 onwards, just keep a watch on how, and even in this image, you can see tractor trails and having done a little bit of damage here. But most of the nesting area is still intact. And just keep observing what happens to this between 15 and later on. This is 2017, 2018, the end of 2018, 2019, 2020, although this is just post-flood, 22, and yeah, this is the end of 22. And so we've had a couple of very large monsoons in this interim period. 2019 was a very large flood, followed by the biggest flood in 2022, which did bring a fair amount of sediment and so on. But as soon as the water receded, they were back to mining these sites. And yeah, this is now a completely unviable nesting area. And many of you may already be familiar with the Chambal, which was infamous for dacoity and basically lawlessness. And that continues with the kind of mining that goes on. It's certainly controlled by what can be termed a mafia. It has both local political patronage and support from corrupt administration. And when this has been seen through what's been, what do you say, analyzed academically, so this can be understood in the sense of criminal political economy. which governs mining in the Chambal and in much of India where illegal mining goes on, and is best understood not as a failure of law enforcement alone, but rather a systemic outcome of India's growth model and its election finance practices and fragmented environmental governance. Um, this is fundamentally a demand-driven process, and the demand being from rapid urbanization. Then we're seeing infrastructure expansion, large highways coming up, and also real estate-led growth. And this has given an impetus to the sand mining mafias, illegal sand mining, to fill in that demand because legal mines are um, there's poor governance, there's red tapeism, and so on. And illegal mining brings sand quicker and cheaper into these sorts of markets. And it's also best understood as um, uh, not simply as an organized crime in the typical sense, uh, but more as a disaggregated, what would you say, but coordinated assemblage of actors, where violence and coercion are not constant but episodic. They're episodic but very effective, and these sorts of attacks on both journalists, on police, on forest staff, and so on. They're not aberrations, but mechanisms of the governance in here, and it's also uh, where the state is partially or fully complicit in many of these instances. Yeah, so this has been one of the challenges in trying to both curb this institutionally and socially also. And what we're also noticing over the last few years is that uh, a fair number of minors are being involved. Minors, as in people under 18, are now involved in illegal sand mining, especially in the transport of it, because the mining mafias understood that it's difficult to punish minors legally. And so we're often seeing school students or dropouts being used in the transport of mined goods from mines to markets in Agra and Gwalior. So I'll end here, and I can take questions, or we can carry the discussion forward.
Yes, thank you, Tarun. I think the scale of mining that you showed is sometimes really mind-boggling, and just my mind doesn't feel capable of understanding what's happening at this scale. And even the system that you described, how that is driving the mining with the power and the money as drivers. So, on that note, maybe I can share a few questions that have been asked on the chat. Karan has said that if he can get his email, get your email ID, they are interested in building a career in wildlife conservation. They're pursuing their MSc Zoology. Maybe what we can do, Karan, is we will soon be sharing a recording of this session, and we will have Tarun also, his email ID also on the as a CC, so you can reach out to Tarun from there. Um, Siddharth has asked, has the conservation changed with authorities on the need for ecological flows? Has the conversation changed with authorities about the ecological flows?
Sorry, I meant conversation.
Oh, right. Yeah, so I think there has been change, although it's slow, much of it in paper, but there's at least acknowledgement that ecological flows have to be considered. Um, um, the draft of the national water policy does take into account, and you're increasingly seeing both uh, other other conservation organizations and even the forest departments acknowledging the role of ecological flows and the need to estimate these in these sorts of regulated rivers. And that's an important acknowledgement, because most gharial habitats and most riverine habitats in India are regulated and under increasing forms of regulation, both from existing and newly constructed dams and diversions. So yes, so that's a it's a slow process. It's taken time, and it's also made difficult because there are no set formulaic ways of estimating ecological flows. It all often depends on what the end goals are, what the objectives are for the particular system, and what's driving that. So yes, the process is long, but there is it's going in the right direction, at least. May not be fast enough, but yes.
Okay. Mayurika has asked, how is the process for gharial conservation being made sustainable? Has perception changed with time?
Sorry, I didn't. Could you repeat that?
I can repeat that question if necessary. So to be a little more specific, considering that there are these immense challenges with the sand mafia and sand mining. So given that the gharial is a predator, are there? Firstly, there are two parts to this question. The first one is, with these challenges in sand mining with the sand mafia, how is the process for conservation being made sustainable? That is the first question. And my second question is, because so conservation efforts, they require a lot of stakeholder involvement. So have perceptions among stakeholders, especially in the community itself, changed with time with your incredible work?
So at least I'll try and give you the Chambal example. So this has been a long-standing challenge. So in the early 2000s, there was an effort to denotify a part of the sanctuary, with the argument being that allowing some legal mining will help curb illegal mining in the rest of the sanctuary while meeting local needs for sand. But what often happened was that the tokens from these mines were found across the river. So people are mining everywhere, but using stamps or permits from the legal mine to mine elsewhere. And that made enforcement impossible, because they all had some paperwork connecting them to the legal mine. And that goes back to the issue of so there's an understanding in law enforcement and in the banning of substances and so on, that if you're unable to ban, or if you're unable to curb an illegal activity, it's nearly impossible to regulate it, because you simply don't have the resources. Regulation takes a lot more resources in human resources and technological know-how and so on. And if you're unable to ban what's outright illegal, it's going to be much more difficult to regulate it, because you need many more processes and people looking at these sorts of issues. That's one. And over the last 3 or 4 years, there was another attempt to denotify 5 sections in the Chambal sanctuary. It got the clearance of the National Board of Wildlife and the State Board of Wildlife, but the final notification never got passed. So although illegal mining continues, it was never formally legalized. And now, with the pressure of several groups working here, we hear that the government has gone back and asked for re-notification of the denotified areas. So they're planning to cancel the denotified mines. And this is again to do with the inability of local administration to enforce or to manage these sorts of legal mines. And it's a two-way process. You need to have societies where there's some, people are willing to comply with existing rules. And the Chambal is not particularly famous for that. So yes, so there are those challenges. And in terms of perceptions, so here people now think of sand mining as their given right because they've done so for so long with no real challenge or pushback. And it's also now become a large cottage industry, if you could call it that. There's several people involved in it, so it becomes all the more difficult to enforce this at scale. And but we've seen in our own from the last few years that if the administration and government wants to enforce the rule of law, they can do it. The first time we all quietly complied and stood in line during the demonetization, the notebandi that came into effect. And then again during COVID, we were all stuck at home. The entire country was forced to comply with that. So when the government needs to, it can enforce its will. It's just that because there are so many political interests and backing to illegal sand mining, it's become difficult to stop. But it's not impossible, yes. And we have examples even from the Chambal itself. Whenever you have good officers who are posted here, especially when they are from outside the region, you see an immediate change in how other government functionaries work. And to give you just one example, the last superintendent of police in Dholpur was very strict, and because of his actions, a nesting site that was non-functional for close to 8 or 10 years. We had nesting last year for the first time after very long, simply because it was not being mined. Unfortunately, he's been transferred, which often happens with good officers. He's been moved to look after traffic in Jaipur. So now we have to try and work with the new incumbent and see how sensitive they are to conservation interests and to maintaining the rule of law in the area. So our work starts all over again.
Yeah, okay. Siddharth has asked, can we possibly draw any links between the presence or absence of gharials with availability of local resources such as land and water?
As tempting as it would be, I think it's difficult to say so. With many species, and that's to do with most large.
While we wait for Tarun to be back, I will also invite people to check out the India Sandwatch platform. We will put the link in the chat soon. And also check out and learn more about the work WCT is doing. We share the link for WCT as well. Okay. Like I said in the beginning, we're also uh, committed to empower people to take action, and in line of that thinking, we have created a few toolkits and tools for people to take action. A very small action can also be a part of it. We will share the link on the chat and feel free to check it out. And if you want to take some action and on the issue of sand mining, we also invite you to volunteer with us. And we also have something that's regularly we're trying to do is citizen action hours. In the same line of thinking that people who want to take action join us, uh, think with us, plan and take action on the issue of river sand mining. We will share the links of all of that on the chat. And if you're interested specifically, we can also you can leave your email on chat and we'll send you more details on how you can participate and take action.
Sorry, it dropped.
Yes, hi. Welcome back.
Because I'm connected to my phone.
Okay, cool. Yes, I think you were answering the question of the link between the presence of and absence of gharial. with availability of resources like land and water. Hi, Tarun, can you hear?
Yes. So it becomes difficult to do so because we don't have very many examples of systems where you have large populations of gharials that are say self-sustaining populations like the Chambal. But typically, at least the sites where they are breeding today, if you take the Chambal, the Gagra, the Gandak, parts of Corbett, these are systems that are relatively still clean. There's a relative amount of fresh water, and these are for most of the year they're still fairly protected. Human disturbances are comparatively low. So these are some common features of these systems. But I don't think, I'm not sure we can use at least this presence of gharials as indicative or as predictors of these sorts of conditions.
Okay. I think Deepal Damania has asked if it's a protected area, and Siddharth has replied that yes, on paper it is a protected area. Next question is, yeah, did you want to say something, Tarun?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. So the Chambal has been protected since the late 70s, early 80s across 3 states, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and Uttar Pradesh. And it's a combination of both being a protected area and the landscape. You've probably heard of the famous or infamous ravines that are found here. They're geological features. These are highly erosional surfaces. And that combined with the infamy of the dacoits didn't allow a lot of industries and so on to be set up along this river. And you don't have very many large human settlements too, because of a combination of these factors. And that's allowed the river to be little protected from the rest of the surroundings. And but we're in the danger of losing that, given the large number of heavy machinery in the landscape, the huge number of linear infrastructural projects, roads, railway lines, power lines, pipelines, and so on. So all of these, yes, are challenges that are emerging, and yeah, we'll have to deal with them as they come. Yes.
Okay, I think we just have time for one question more. Vishal has asked that there must be a nexus of police and mafia for this scale of exploitation. And has there been any major activism movements against these mafia and the complicit authorities, or any successful hearings? And if there is any active campaign where we can also contribute?
So, if there's active involvement, yes, absolutely, because all the illegal mining here happens in broad daylight. Consignments go through the middle of town, through the day, through the year. So it can't be happening without everyone's knowledge. So people are complicit, certainly. And what we can do is an active citizenry is, I think, a great example is Veditum's India Sand Watch, where we can record and put all of these instances, both direct observations, news reports, and so on, in a public platform, which both highlights it and archives this sort of information. And one example, which I've mentioned earlier too, was just from one article that somebody who was a bird watcher and a tourist in the Chambal, he'd seen what was happening. He wrote about it in the Hindu because he had contacts there. And that article got picked up by the National Green Tribunal. They issued suo motu orders to the states on what needs to be done. And the states had to follow up. So local officers got pulled up. They had to show what they're doing to stop mining and so on. So there have been, yes, small incremental changes, but it also means that we have to continue with these sorts of efforts to be watchdogs. Unfortunately, there haven't been very many participants in this from local communities, and in the sense that of locals reporting. And that's because of two reasons. One, because so many people are involved in it. Most people you talk to have either are involved directly in illegal sand mining or have family members involved in it, or are fearful of reprisals from the sand mafia. So there's that, yes. So yeah, but it's easier for people from the outside to keep watch because you're not as vulnerable as somebody living locally.
Yeah, thanks for sharing the example also, Tarun. It also helps us complete the session on a hopeful note. And also thanks for sharing the India Sandwatch about the India Sandwatch platform. Please do check it out and also check out the work that WCT is doing. Um, Thank you so much for everyone for joining, and thank you so much, Tarun, for the wonderful conversation. It's always a lot of learning when we hear from you. And do follow us on Instagram. We are Veditum. We are India Sandwatch, and you can also follow WCT India on Instagram to know more and to know about the updates of what we're planning again. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Ashani.
Tarunji, thank you.
Siddharth and everyone at Veditum. Thank you.